Good evening, everyone. I'm Sandra Brooke Gordon. I'm the Avery Director of the Huntington Library. And on behalf of the library and of my colleague, Dr. Susan Juster, W.M. Keck Foundation Director of Research, it is our pleasure to welcome you to Rothenberg Hall and the 2025 Zeidberg Lecture in the History of the Book. Tonight, we will be hearing from Dr. Cristina Dondi on the topic of early books migration, European upheaval, and American collections. This lecture series was established in 2019 to honor David Zeidberg, who served as Avery Director of the Library from 1996 to 2018. The series was a felicitous creation, entwining both David's own scholarly interest in book history and early printing, and the Huntington's rich holdings in that field. With over 400,000 books from the hand press era, the Huntington is one of the world's richest sources for the printed record of Great Britain and the United States, and as you'll see tonight, beyond as well. Copies of more than 1/3 of known English editions through 1640 are present in the collections, and nearly 1/3 of known editions from 1641 to 1700. With over 5,200 incunabula, books printed in the West before 1501, not counting multiple copies, the Huntington collection ranks second in number in the United States. And the Huntington's incunabula holdings begin with nothing less than a remarkable copy printed on vellum of the Gutenberg Bible, the earliest substantial book to be printed from movable type in the West. We are very honored tonight to have as our speaker Dr. Cristina Dondi, one of the deans of early European book heritage. Appointed Professor of Modern History at the Sapienza Università di Roma in 2024, Dr. Dondi was Oakeshott Senior Research Fellow in the Humanities at Lincoln College, Oxford, from 2014 to 2023. She studied medieval history at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan, and she earned her doctorate in history at King's College, London. A sought-after expert in the field, Dr. Dondi has an enviable range of knowledge, from an exquisite ability to decipher the minute material evidence of a single book's individual history, to a passion for connecting thousands of data points about early books to reveal larger patterns of trade, use, and intellectual commerce. Taking these insights to the larger public is another of her particular gifts. For example, in 2018 and 19, Dr. Dondi organized a landmark exhibition at the Museo Correr and the Biblioteca Marziana in Venice, Printing Revolution 1450 to 1500, 50 years that changed Europe, a show that received some 200,000 visitors from all over the world and that lives on in a dedicated website. For the past 16 years, Dr. Dondi has also served a pivotal role as secretary for CERL, the Consortium of European Research Libraries. This 267-member-strong association, of which the Huntington is a member, is an engine of innovation for sharing resources and expertise among research libraries with a view to improving access to and the exploitation and preservation of European printed heritage in the hand press era, that is, up to around 1850. One of CERL's landmark initiatives envisioned and led by Dr. Dondi is the MEI project. MEI, which stands for Material Evidence in Incunabula, provides a unified structure and database for recording critical information about books printed before 1501. MEI editors look for and record evidence of ownership, details of decoration and binding, and manuscript annotation stamps and prices for early books. Since 2019, the Huntington has also benefited from a competitive and collaborative CERL MEI internship and fellowship program. The MEI Fellows Program brings qualified librarians and researchers from Europe to the US and the Huntington for 1 month to work alongside expert staff here, most especially Stephen Tabor, the library's curator of rare books. Searle Fellows study selected incunables in our collection and record details about them in the growing international MEI database. And may I say, in his retirement, this is what David Zeidberg does as well. With assistance from the Searle program, the Huntington has now hosted several MEI fellows, ranging from budding adherents to the bookish arts, who are tomorrow's leaders in the field, to advanced researchers such as Isabel Hernandez Gomez de Caso, curator of the National Library of Spain. Sadly, it seems that breaking rather than building alliances is in some fears the mode du jour. But international cooperatives such as Searle are critical for the advancement of libraries, scholarship, and the power of the humanities. And we are deeply grateful for our association with Dr. Dondi and our Searle colleagues and sister libraries. And now for tonight's lecture, Early Books Migration, European Upheaval, and American Collections. It is with great pleasure that I invite our distinguished speaker to the podium. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cristina Dondi.
Thank you, Sandra. It is wonderful to be back here after we established more than 20 years since my first and only visit. And I'm very grateful to the Huntington Library and David Zeidberg for the invitation to give the lecture today, which also marks the beginning of a new collaborative project together, and you will hear about as I speak. I'll start. So the theme, the books we will be talking about today in the lecture are really incunabula, books printed between 1450 and 1500. Around 28,000 editions survive in the world today in multiple copies for 500,000 estimated, actually not counted, copies in more or less 4,000 libraries, public libraries, in the world. The concentration of incunabula is mostly in Europe, and second, as you can see, in the United States, where there are more or less 10% of the surviving copies, around 50,000 copies. So in those early first 50 years of printing in Europe, printing presses developed in 262 places everywhere in Europe, as you can see. Venice alone, around 1500, that's a famous map from Jacopo de Barbari, had a concentration of over 200 printing presses. And very quickly, by the 1480s, Venice became the largest place of production and distribution of books all over Europe. The reason for such flourishing of and success of the introduction of the new technology was the demand factor, the fact that in Europe there was already a very large production of manuscripts, not only deluxe manuscripts, but ordinary manuscripts for all sorts of purposes, and there was the need for more books. And that is really one of the driving factors, a bottom-up commercial operation that took off very, very quickly. You, of course, are familiar with the Gutenberg Bible, and just also mentioned the wonderful copy here at the Huntington. But even before printing the Bible, Gutenberg printed a grammar book. And as you can see from what survives in fragments. This is another fragment. And only these bits have been found in bindings, broken into pieces and reused for different purposes. So that grammar was Donatus, a classical text that still was very much the book for primary education into the Renaissance period. And there are over 500 editions that were printed in multiple copies of Donatus. Donatus was the first book printed in Germany, the first book printed in Italy, in the Netherlands. So it is very interesting, this connection between the spread of printing and the spread of literacy. Even if most of the copies of Donatus have completely disappeared or survive in fragment, we also have external evidence which allows us to show the importance of this kind of material, printed literacy material in the early period. And that comes in the form of documentary evidence. What you see shown here is the Giornale, or the account book of a Venetian bookseller, Francesco de Madis. We have identified him as a small-time printer, but large-scale bookseller in the very heart of the market area of Venice, the Mercerie. This account book has over 150 pages of very tightly written listing of all the books that he sold with the price that was the customers paid. And for, as you can see, just over, less than 4 years, he sold over 13,000 printed books. And this is just 15 years after the invention of printing was introduced in Venice. So what were the bestsellers? Which is the title that appears more often than anything in this account book? It's not the Bible, it's not the classics, it's again grammar books, books for primary education. In particular, the way they called it is Salteriolo da Putti, little psalter for kids, for learning to read. And over 600 copies, 660 copies are sold, and the price of this book is between 1 and 4 soldi. So the question is, what could you buy in Venice for 1 or 4 soldi in 1480s? Well, with 1 soldo, you can buy a pound of cherry, or with 4 soldi, a chicken. This information, of course, comes again from documentary evidence of documents of exactly the same time of the printing of the books from the archives of Venice. Having made a statistic of which were the bestsellers listed in this account book, you can see in the purple color, after the Salteriolo, other grammar books. Also very well placed is the Donatus. This is a beautiful copy that survives. It's the only copy in the world of this incredibly popular publication. And of course, why it is survived, because there is this beautiful border that makes it stick out from maybe some of the early grammars of Gutenberg that you saw before. Anyway, so this again cost 5 soldi. What else could you buy with 5 soldi in Venice? A haircut. Or 100 squids. Last one that I'll share with you is yet another grammar, by a humanist scholar, Guarino Veronese. This is a very interesting publication because there are translations between Latin and Italian, but Italian Venetian. So it's a very also interesting document for understanding the evolution of the language in this period. Again, a lot of regule di Guarino were sold in the Giornale for, again, 4 soldi. What else you could buy? An excellent eel. So the message here, and these are lovely images that come from the videos we created for the exhibition you heard mentioned in Venice, is that certain kind of books in this period are already attainable. So forget about printing for the elites only. Clearly, a massive book of legal documents. It was expensive, but probably was not what some of the shopkeepers wanted to buy. So I think it's very important to bring to the attention this kind of publications, which, of course, today have almost all disappeared, but with the help of archival complementary sources, we can understand how extended they were produced and circulated. So, as mentioned, whatever was printed in Venice was quickly distributed everywhere in Europe. That is yet another reason why Venice became the center of production, because they had a very established channel of distribution of these books through the commercial network that the city had already. So, given that fact, we need to understand that where the book was printed and where the book is today tells us very little of where a book has been during the 500 years of its history, because books moved extensively over this period. So one of the purposes of my research and the database I created already 15 years ago is to capture the movement that during the 15th century is basically the initial distribution of the books. But then from the 16th century onward, it's all about the survival of these books, and whether they continue to be used or then kept for different purposes. And we come to our example, what we also used in the leaflet, and one of the earliest exemplars of incunabula here in the Huntington, the Lactantius, printed in Rome in 1468. As you can see, these books were finished by hand. The initial, the M, the space was left, the borders were added, but also you can see at the top that there is an ownership inscription. What does it say? It says that the book belonged to the monastery of Vallombrosa for the use of Master Verdiano from San Martino. Vallombrosa is just south of Florence in Tuscany. The monastery still stands today, is in this beautiful setting, as a Benedictine monastery. This is his main entrance. And this is the library as it is today, but this monastery, like many, many others, had a very up and down kind of life. It was founded in the 11th century and survived until 1810. What happened in 1810? Napoleon secularized the monasteries of Italy, as well as Germany, in France, and other places. And that meant that the collections of all these manuscripts were displaced. We'll come back to this. Nonetheless, in 1817, the monastery opened again. But then in 1866, there was a second secularization in Italy. This time, at the time of the formation of the Italian state. And so, yet again, probably the books were moved in various places and dispersed. And then finally, in 1949, reopened and is still standing today. So, what was that library? What kind of library did they have? What else was there beyond the Lactanzio that is now at the Huntington? We have a wonderful documentary source to discover that. And it's called The Research into the Inquiry of the Congregation of the Index. This was an investigation ordered by the Catholic Church in Italy to basically check the content of all the monastic libraries in Europe just before the year 1600. The purpose was obviously one of control, making sure that there would not be reform books. Multiple manuscripts were produced. People were sent to record the content of the books. And so that means that today we have a photography of the content of hundreds and hundreds of monastic libraries in Italy. And a wonderful project has been ongoing for at least 2 decades, which transcribed them and identified the editions. So for that reason, I could find out that Vallombrosa, by 1600, had 1,335 editions, of which 77 were incunabula. This one, the Lactantius, was not listed. So where are today all these books? Well, none in Vallombrosa, 45 in the National Library in Florence, 1 at the Huntington, but maybe more, we will see. 1 we found in Buenos Aires, 1 in Cambridge, UK, and the rest. That is what we are looking for. This is the copy in Buenos Aires. As you can see, a very nice Italian-style illumination. Also was used in a monastic context before then circulated in the market. So the Huntington Lactantius gives us some further evidence of the life of this book in the later centuries. After spending time in Vallombrosa, it moved to another Benedictine convent, Montescalari, that also is very near Florence, and still in a less pristine shape, there is the monastery. So the inscription basically gives the ownership, and then there is a caveat of, be careful, you can read this book as much as you like, but careful, don't take it away, because you can be excommunicated. But the book was moved, and we can see here that there is also a stamp of Florence, the Benedictines again, so books moving from community to community within the order. Santa Trinità. Santa Trinità in Florence is well known for this wonderful Cappella Sassetti by Ghirlandaio, but maybe people didn't know much that they also had a very important library. From the same Vatican archives, we know that they had at least 441 editions, of which 23 incunables, and the list does include the Lactantius of the Huntington. So, where are the books of Santa Trinità today? 2 at the National Library in Florence, 1, hopefully more, at the Huntington, and the rest we don't know. And this is a very common situation for thousands of historical libraries of the past, as you will see. The Lactantius eventually entered the collection of Thomas Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke. in the wonderful Wilton House in Salisbury collection. Very likely it was picked up by him during his grand tour of 1676, and the book stayed in that collection until the heirs eventually sold it in 1914. So, Huntington has quite a number of these books. Then you see there is Princeton, there is Cambridge, Williams College, Athens, New York, London. Just, you see how these collections spread around. At the Pembroke sale, the bookseller George Smith bought that book and then sold it in block to Huntington in 1916 for, I don't know actually how many other books were involved, but for a hefty sum of $90,000. So this is just one case of the 50,000 incunabula in American collections for which we want to reconstruct their past history and how they entered their collection today in the United States. This is another representation where you can see very clearly that there are 4 major collections in the United States. One is the Huntington, and then there is the Library of Congress, then there is the New York area, Yale, Harvard, Chicago. These are the largest collection, but there are hundreds of smaller collections with like 5, 10, 50, 200 of these very rare books. So this is going to be at the heart of this new project, Printing Revolution and American Collections, the migration of cultural heritage at times of political change. This wants to answer to the question, so what was behind this increased availability of antiquarian books on the European market, and or what enabled the activities of scholars, booksellers, private collectors, and libraries. And the hypothesis is that basically political events had a major influence on the movement and breaking down of collections. To begin with, the suppression of religious orders. This is not just one event. This happened in Europe from the 16th century to the 19th and 20th century, beginning with the secularization of Henry VIII in the 16th century England, moving to the secularizations in the Austrian Empire of Joseph II at the center, then the secularizations of Napoleon between 1800, 1810, then the secularizations following the formation of the national states in Spain, that is Mendizábal, who did the, it's called the amortización, which is the same concept, or the formation of the Italian state. The same thing happened for the formation of the Greek state. There was the will to take over the wealth of these religious institutions, and their books was just collateral damage. The results, some books were destroyed, others were moved into the newly created national libraries or state libraries, others then were instead sold. And at a time when American collections instead were and collectors were very keen to acquire this kind of material. We had a conference in Oxford 20 years ago to look at this phenomenon exactly in its complexity, with both chronological and geographical. And the publication was followed it was published only 2 years ago. Yeah, it took a while. but all for the quality of the research. And we had to accept that there are certain areas where we were not able to understand what happened, because that is the state of the documentation of the research. So hopefully more will continue. The project that I mentioned, it will be coordinated by myself at Sapienza University in Rome. It is funded by the Italian National Research Funding Body, Fondo Italiano per la Scienza. It will last for 4 years. And we will concentrate with scholars working on the, as I said, the 4 main areas of American collections, but also the almost 700 smaller US collections. And how are we going to do it? Mostly remotely. So we experimented during COVID in the preparation of a project that was funded by the Polonsky Foundation, and it was a census of all the copies of the first edition of the Commedia of Dante, which was printed in Florence in 1481. 135 libraries around the world had a copy of this edition. I wrote a letter to each and one of them asking for images which provided the ownership inscription, the decoration, basically so that we could do the research and the description, and everybody sent them images. So we understood that these days we can also work remotely with simple pictures taken by phone that can travel from server to server, and so we don't need to be on book in hand all the time. All the work done by the researchers remotely, but also the one that will be instead based locally, taking the pictures, will be uploaded into the material evidence incunabula database that you heard about. This is its front page, where we really reconstruct the history of each book from the moment it was printed until it got into the library where it is today. What is special about this database is that every former owner, any element of the movement of the book, it is captured in time and space. This, you have an example of another book that was in the hand of Henry Huth. And as you can see, we have a geolocalization of his library in London with georeferences. The area is England. We have the period in which he had the book. And then there is a link to the Searle Provenance Digital Archive, which is really a database of images of provenance, where we capture decoration, handwriting, stamps, whatever, and we link them to the database. So everybody can verify what is the evidence of the record described. We have done this so far for over 67,000 incunabula around the world, from 741 libraries in 36 countries in 4 continents. All this work has been done by, we call them May editors, which is a wonderful collaboration of librarians and scholars at the beginning or at the end of your careers. And David was one of these wonderful persons who created a number of records, and hopefully will do many more for this library. In the process of bringing all this evidence together, we are in the process of reconstructing the libraries or book collections of over 29,000 other owners, institutional or individual. What's the situation of the presence of the US library so far? Over 3,000 editions in almost 5,000 copies, more or less 10%. The records have been created, as you see, not Huntington, Berkeley, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Chicago, Iowa, Washington, Austin, Texas, Williams College, Bryn Mawr, Philadelphia, New York City, Morgan, Columbia, and it continues on. I would like to acknowledge the wonderful role of John Lancaster, originally from Smith's College, renowned librarians, who has been really a driving force for expanding and introducing to MEI many librarians and scholars in the US. And I also again acknowledge the Huntington internship joined with SIR that really has brought here a number of scholars to work on the collection. And we had similar grants also in Yale. I mentioned that we already experimenting this work remotely, and we did so in this Dante Illustrated Copy Census of 2021. So it is a special edition. Is the first Florentine edition of Dante Commedia with illustration provided in metal cuts based on drawings by Botticelli. So rather wonderful. 180 copies survive today in 135 libraries. What is an illustrated copy census? It's looking at all the surviving copies of a certain edition to really ascertain what kind of impact that text had on contemporaries and also on later owners, scholars, students, and so on. A very famous census is the one by the former professor of astronomy at Harvard, Gingrich, who wrote the De Revolutionibus, did the census on 2 editions of Copernicus. It took 30 years for him to do this wonderful work, which is really set, the situation as it was, how influential this book actually has been. The similar work has been done for the Shakespeare First Folio or for the Gutenberg Bible by Eric White. So we thought Dante would also be deserving of the same treatment, and we did it at a time when it was a big centenary anniversary. So among the copies that we found in the US, and there were several, there is, for example, this one in Mills College, Oakland, with this beautiful initial and border decoration, and even the woodcuts, the metal cuts colored in at the bottom. So this is interesting in itself, that Mills College has got his decorated initial. But when having looked at all the surviving copies, we were able to see that, for example, that style of the initial N with Dante inside the letter was also in the decoration of the copy in Florence, in Rome, in Stuttgart, in Harvard. So you start to begin to pick up a trend. The Huntington copy has these very interesting marginal additions that basically entire chunks of text were left out from the printing of the edition, quite defective. And this was added. If you only saw one copy with these marginal notes, you would be left thinking, was this correction added in the printing shop before the book started to be distributed? Or was actually an owner who gets hold to another copy and starts writing down what's missing? How can you tell? The only way you can tell is by looking at other copies. And we found 34 copies with similar corrections in different hands, in different Italian language. This means that it was the users who read the book so carefully that identified the missing bits, got hold of other text, and added what was missing. Because Bologna had them, and Livorno, Turin, Verona, Rome, Glasgow, Berlin, Wellesley. So this is the value of looking at all the surviving copies of one edition. You really understand the interaction of the users with that edition and that text. Because we geolocalize our copies, you can see we have this live movement of the distribution from Florence to where all the copies are today in our public space where we have these visualizations. So, you understand how all this work relies on the former users, the provenance. And just to show you how much of this provenance comes from suppressed monasteries in thousands, I've looked at the index of 4 major collections: Oxford, Cambridge, UK, London British Library, and Harvard, and selected and put in a spreadsheet in all the ones that came from monastery. These are the results. So in Oxford, we have over 1,300 incunabula that comes from 567 different European monasteries. Cambridge, from 355 different European monasteries. British Library, from 769 different European monasteries. And Harvard, 372 different European monasteries in multiple copies are present. And these, we already counted thousands, are just 4 libraries. So you understand the extent of the spread of these former historical monastic collections now in our collections. So the upheaval of cultural heritage connected with political events is not a new subject, and we today are all too familiar with this. But this does not mean that unavoidable phenomena should not be studied and understood in their making and in their chain reactions. Because we can be prepared, and because with the support of collaborative research and technology, we can bring virtually together what history has divided, so that the innumerable shards can be better understood, not only in themselves, but mostly so in a connected context. I'll give you a final example. This is the beautiful, again, Benedictine monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, opposite St. Mark's Square. This is a beautiful image of the library as it was in the, I think, 18th century. This is the library today, after all the shelving were taken away after Napoleon, and then they were acquired back, taken from a secondary school. So from this important late medieval and early modern library, there are multiple sources we can trace the book. For example, we have illumination, which includes St. George and the Dragon, and that has been a pointer to books decorated for the monastery. There are multiple inscriptions. There are wonderful sequestration lists and that we use to reconstruct this collection. These are just some of the ownership inscriptions from the 16th century onwards that we find inside the books. And this is the all incredibly valuable material documents. These are lists of books that during the Napoleonic period were taken away to Paris. Lists that say what was returned. Lists over lists that for us allow the reconstruction of these collections, and even when we don't know where the books are. So in the MEI database, if you search for San Giorgio, you will see that there are a link to 181 copies. This is what the database looks like. If you click on that, you have a list of all the copies, and immediately on the side, on the facet, by holding institution, the dispersal under our eyes. So, of course, books are where they're supposed to be. Secularized books were taken to Padua. And in Padua, there are 35. So where the others went? Well, 17 were taken to Paris, and they're still in Paris. Different, some often inferior copies, were sent back to Venice. Some copies are in Venice. But all the other places, we could not have thought, for the history we knew, where to go and look for them. But because all these libraries are cataloged in the same database, the information comes to us, and we bit by bit reconstruct this collection. Why is it important that we do this? Because if we only looked at the books today in Padua, the leftover of this collection, we would have a completely misleading impression of the intellectual stature of this institution. Market forces determine the displacement of the most valuable, or so perceived, editions. So those printed by the famous printers of the modern period, Nicholas Jenson, John of Cologne, Aldus Manutius, they are not in Padua. These editions also happens to be the non-theological subjects. If we have an overview of the reconstruction of the library, you will see the number of classics, the text of astronomy, of medicine, of geography, of architecture, all books that now are not in Padua, where they were all supposed to be. This is just an example. This beautiful book of architecture with initials printed by Jenson is today in Milan at the Braidense. I only give you another example. We knew that from those lists, a beautiful Euclide Elementa book of geometry was part of the collection. We knew from documents that he ended up in Padua, but between 1813 and 38, the book vanishes. Where is it? Austin, Texas. They cataloged in May. The book popped up. Wonderful. Then I got in touch. I asked for the picture, and sure enough, we have this wonderful early 15th century ownership inscription with the shelf mark number. There were over 1,000 of incunabula in this collection. I mean, it was an incredible library. The other big factor, phenomenon that we will look into during our project is the displacement of World War I and World War II. Just briefly mentioning that areas like Florence in particular, still full of books in their libraries today, have the same amount of books spread around the libraries of the world, and many here in the US. And not small part has to do with Florentine-based antiquarian dealers like Olszki, Tamar de Marinis, and Giuseppe Martini. So their also involvement with the trade between Europe and US has been in recent years worked on by another European Research Council funded project based in London, the University of London, the principal investigator Laura Cleaver, and they concentrated on the trade of manuscripts, medieval manuscripts, between Britain and America. So it's clear that incunabula will probably follow some of these patterns, but sometimes not. But it will be very interesting then to compare results. I've shown you today two types of book-based historical investigation that is really the kind of cutting edge in book history. It's the copy census, and I showed you the Dante, and the reconstruction of dispersed libraries, like Vallombrosa, like San Giorgio in Venice. Every book counts. And just to give you a final example, I'll show you another copy of Dante, printed in 1497. This copy is in Sydney University Library. You see that in this front page, you have a drawing and some contemporary writing. What does it say? Well, the note says that on 17th September, Giorgio from Castelfranco died of the plague. He was an excellent painter in Venice. He was 36 years old. Rest in peace. And this is the beautiful drawing. What are we talking here about? Giorgione. Giorgione's date of death was not known, or probably birth. And this inscription in this incunabula in Sydney, Australia, has revolutionized, galvanized, let's say, the art historical world, because they finally were able to pin down the dates of lives and activity of Giorgione. An article in the Burlington magazine has already been published. So what is the message here? Is that each copy in itself is a wonderful story. But if we can join the dots, then we understand the big picture. We understand the history that joins all of these. Our heritage is shared. And the perfect cocktail to work on it, my experience, is 1/3 research-based cataloging, 1/3 good technology, and 1/3 collaboration. Then, of course, time. We cannot cut corners. Time is necessary. And I look forward for the next 4 years of our profitable and wonderful collaboration with the Huntington Library. Thank you.
Cristina, thank you so much. Cocktails, wow, okay. I'm sure we must have some questions, and we have a microphone here, and we can bring it to you if you have some questions.
I was wondering, was there a historical consciousness of this phenomenon of dispersal, like in times prior to now? Or is this something that's only been recognized more recently?
We all had an understanding of the secularization as a political phenomenon. But generally, they were studied on the properties of the monasteries, the land ownership, the other kind of movable wealth. And so really books were always kind of set aside. And so it is really the attention of the last 20 years to focus on the books and on the effect of this phenomenon on the books. So yes, it's fairly recent. And also the fact that we are more systematically looking into documents that testify what was taken, what was moved, what was created. And when you start looking, then you find you find the evidence, and you begin to understand. This is what is so important for us to understand. Is about what survives today in our library, which is, we understand it better also by understanding what we have lost. And we understand the process of selection, what was thrown away, what was kept. Classics were kept. And in fact, that has almost offered a distorted perception that printing was mostly printing the classics. that we need to put in a wider context. The content of monastic female monasteries, almost gone. And of course, popular prints, popular literature, that is all the sort of things that was thrown away, obsolescence, school books, but then again the documents tell us so much of that was produced, and that means producing for a wider society, not just for the scholars, not just for science, not just for religion. This is a general trend of the history of the book, looking at more common, popular printing. There is a lot of that going on at the moment, which sometimes means that we have to deal in fragments, in smaller quantities, but as you can see with bibliographical and documentary evidence, we can reconstruct a better picture.
You kind of briefly talked about it just now, over here, sorry. You mentioned that the first book that really became a bestseller was this grammar book, or grammar document. Did that correlate to literacy rates at that time? Was it just children using these books, or was it just an influx of adults even learning grammar at that time, now that it was more currently available?
Yeah, I think this was the biggest revelation of our research when we ran the big research project in Oxford and going through the account book of the bookseller. It's that you can finally show the correlation between expansion of printing or introduction of printing and expansion in literacy. We know, for example, that there were areas of high literacy. Venice was one of those, and Florence was another. And generally that coincides with mercantile activities and trade. In Florence, where printing never really develops in the large scale of Venice, they do print a lot of popular printing in the vernacular. Again, we know because of the diary of nuns that were printers in Florence in the 1480s. And so we know many titles that they printed that don't exist today, and the kind of customers they had. And so that shows that when you have that kind of material of very wide circulation, it shows a quite raised level of literacy. And then, of course, you also have to do some consideration about the quantity. By 1500, with total estimate of print runs just based on the editions we have, and of course many other editions probably have disappeared, there is really a minimum estimate of 15 million books circulating in Europe. Somebody was reading them. And so that is another argument for the success, the velocity in which the new technology spread. Did I answer? Okay.
With all the extra imagery and data that's available, that's coming in for all these libraries, are you able to draw, and infer something about the diffusion and development of print culture? Can you see how the typography changed? Can you see how the, say, punch cutters degraded between editions or reprints and were, upgraded, changed, how they diffuse across, the print shops, et cetera?
Yeah. So I think one of the most important discoveries of very recent years in terms of typography has been done by recently a PhD student who himself is a digital typographer, digital type designer. And he did his PhD at Reading, where there is an important department of history of typography. And he worked on the earliest Venetian types. And with the technology of today, much enhanced, he basically was able to discover that very early on in Venice, the printers were selling matrices and types. This phenomenon of selling matrices and types, so that basically somebody can come and be new to the profession. Remember, printers didn't exist, so it's a new profession. And they could come to Venice and not being punch cutter, able to cut their own set of types because they could purchase it. It's a complete novelty. Until recently, we thought that this phenomenon of buying and selling matrices and types started in Paris in 1550. What this scholar called Riccardo Locco has discovered is that this happened a century before, very early on in 1480s Venice. And this is yet another piece of the puzzle for us to understand why Venice became such a tremendous place where people from all over Europe would go there and try this new profession. They could buy the equipment. And so, yes, there's been a wonderful developments in incunabula studies in the last 30 years, and more attention to the materiality is unveiling quite a lot. Yeah.
So what was happening in Asia, India, and China? Any of this technology anciently?
Sure. So as you know, printing was developed in Asia centuries before Europe, mostly in woodcut form, but they also developed metal movable type. They continued doing mostly in woodcut form for the centuries, and I think they had the equivalent of our European printing revolution in the 16th, 17th century. And for that I mean when the technology is used for printing, not just for certain groups, certain types, but becomes so widespread that affects the everyday life, and is not state-controlled or religious, church-controlled, but it was a purely commercial, bottom-up kind of operation, because that is what was in Europe. And so that is what happened in Europe in the 15th century. The similar kind of social impact of printing in the East happened, I believe, in the 16th, 17th century. That is from scholars of Chinese printing and history of the book. This, I think, is the situation. And so it's not a thing of primacy, of course, that's totally irrelevant. It's not who printed first. I think what is important is to see the introduction of a new technology and how that affects society. In which ways?
Have you looked into, or what are your thoughts on using AI to help in this cataloging? It seems like with the the stamps, the inscriptions, all the stuff on documents that have probably already been, many of them scanned elsewhere, that you can get a hold of and use that sort of for coordinating your research or helping it.
So, for stamps, will certainly be possible. As ever, you have to feed the machine. So you have to gather it, create metadata for it, so then when you do comparison and identification, you know what you're talking about. For inscription is much more complicated. And basically, at the moment, identification of handwriting only is partially successful when you feed the machine tens and tens of pages, of a manuscript all written in the same way so that a pattern can be identified. This is not at all the case for the thousands and thousands of inscriptions in the books. First, because they are in always a different hand, heavily abbreviated, often cancelled, that the machine still is not able to recognize. But there are excellent paleographers who actually instead can do that in a few minutes. So I think it's very important to balance what can be done with the help of technology and what it's probably still now better done with the human knowledge and the human eye. Of course, we will continue to try and train, but at the moment, it's just a wishful thinking that inscriptions are easily identified.
Hello, thank you for presenting the wonderful project, amazing. I have a question about the future of the migration, because I could see from the map you were showing that there were like new collections probably developing in China now of incunabula. I heard of collectors, avid collectors in Shanghai that are now collecting a lot of incunabula. And I was wondering how much market is still there in like private collections and what you can tell about the future of the migration.
Sure. So, of course, we cannot at the moment quantify what is in private hands because it's information that unless a collector provides it, we can't know. And we do collaborate already with private collectors when they are keen to share what they have with us. We do, and so we included also in the database private collection, both named and unnamed. You can have private collection London, or instead full named. The market is still rather flourishing. I don't have the time to follow all the booksellers and the auctions. Other people luckily do for me, and then they tell me. So there is a flourishing market, and there are a lot of books still also on the market. And sometimes when they're valuable, we also include trade copy. And basically, if there is something that is particularly interesting for us, we put trade copy and basically the last evidence where it was in public domain, the name of the auctioneer, the date of the auction, and so on. Then it goes into a private collection. If they want to share, they tell us. Otherwise, maybe the next round of, it will emerge again, and we will recapture it again. So, because there are so many incunabula in public collections, we said 500,000, that is our priority. But we work with anybody who wants to share their knowledge, the information on their collection. And I was recently at the Grolier Club where I found volunteers, which is a wonderful thing that they will contribute with their collections to the project. Because of course, if they are interested in understanding more of what they have, they understand that setting it in the wider context, they will achieve so much more knowledge about it. But some people buy them for investment or for whatever reason. So we are open for everybody. And we keep track whatever comes our direction.
So in the world of art objects and archaeology items, there's increasing pressure to repatriate a lot of objects to the place they were created or the place they were held for a long time. Is there a similar movement in the book world?
In the what, sorry?
In the world of books, to try to return the texts from whence they came, where they were printed or whether they were first held. The same way that in the art world, they're viewed as cultural legacies that should go back.
Sorry, because I didn't see you before I was coming, I got distracted and I didn't get the beginning of your. Please repeat the question.
In the world, in art objects
Yes.
and certain cultural objects like archaeological finds, there's a big pressure on institutions and museums in the West often to return them to the place of origin or where they were often looted or sold.
Yeah.
Is this happening in the world of books?
So, hot question. And it is happening for those cases that mainly, I think, pertain to Nazi loot, and there are still extant heirs and survivors. And there are collections, and there are libraries who are actively engaging in research of their collection to make those emerge. I think the British Library and also Berlin, they employed researchers to go through their material. When you go beyond that chronological limit, you pass the centuries, the question is, where do you stop? I'm certainly not here advocating that Vallombrosa should get the book back. Books move constantly, and the importance is to understand that movement, understand why it happens, when it happens, how it happened. And then I think once we have these wonderful entangled stories brought to our attention, and suddenly libraries like the Huntington discover that they share heritage, book heritage, with Bologna, Amsterdam, Sicily, whatever. I mean, that is an incredible richness to work on together. Now we can do virtual exhibitions. You can write articles together. It's very easy to digitize materials, so you make it available for collections that have bits of the same heritage that you have. So I can see all of that. I think scholarship has to unite culture, and that is what I think we do. And we have to be very careful not to make culture divisive. I think that would be a disaster. There are ways in the 21st century to work together on this and benefit all. Without the physical movement, I think that is even part of a much wider discourse.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. By looking at this, the perfect cocktail, one-third research-based cataloging, how would you start a project in a library without funding, where let's say that there's only one rare book cataloger or something, how to start recording this provenance without creating backlogs? And also, in the MEI pictures that you sent earlier, you said that pictures were taken with their phones. And is the resolution good enough for a database of that project?
Pictures? Can you read?
Yeah, so you showed a picture of...
the Provenance Digital Archive?
Yes, exactly. It was taken with a phone, you said? With a smartphone or not?
Yes, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
I think I understood. It's what can non-professional libraries with professional librarians do?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes.
So they can work with the libraries. They can ask for help. Among us, for example, MEI editors, we have a circulation list. And we constantly take a picture with our phone, we post it and say, help. Because none of us knows everything. We all know something. And sure enough, if you're in the US and you see an inscription in Italian and you struggle, you post it, and that inscription will be instead very familiar for somebody from Tuscany or Venice or wherever. So it's more than anything is knowing who to ask and wanting to do it. Will is paramount. Once you want to do something, there are ways. And there probably, there will be courses that can be arranged. We organize courses all the time when we run the Oxford project. Now that I'm in Italy, courses on MEI are included in the curriculum, and I'm delighted. And whenever somebody wants, I had private collectors who said, can you teach me how to do it because I want to contribute to MEI? And we have done it. Now that we are going to have a larger group, a large team working with me, it's easier than ever to have people instructing. We also have information online. We have got PowerPoints on how to do it. So really, the will is the first and foremost thing. And then you find a way. And anybody working with incunabula will be very happy to help. We are very curious. We want to know what you have. And we want to try and identify more and more of these wonderful stories.
Among her other gifts to us in her visit here, Cristina has pointed out to us that the Huntington has 70 editions that are presumably unique in the world, incunabula, and probably another 70 that are one of two copies in the world. And we agreed that we should make a priority to have those fully digitized and put up in our digital library. And this kind of work can happen even more quickly when those copies are available for anyone, anywhere in the world. Thank you so much for your talk. We do have refreshments out in the court, and we hope you will stop there and continue to ask questions. And please join me one more time in thanking Dr. Cristina Dondi.
Thank you.